for Democracy and Human Rights, an independent NGO that aims to promote and protect human rights and democracy in Bahrain and across the wider Gulf region. For everyone's information, this event is being live streamed on Salam's Twitter and YouTube pages in both English and Arabic. And just a quick housekeeping point, if everyone could make sure that they have their microphones on mute, that would be greatly appreciated. Just before we begin, I think it's important that we just take a few moments to send our thoughts and prayers to our brothers and sisters in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem. Israel's blatant disregard for international law and the fundamental rights and freedoms we, as human beings, are all meant to enjoy has created an unprecedented amount of pain and suffering for the Palestinian people. The abuses we have all seen being committed against Palestinian civilians, men, women, children, journalists, NGOs, doctors, first responders, and aid workers has been nothing short of appalling. And the perpetrators of such abuses must be held to account. I hope everyone here today will join me in not only calling for an immediate ceasefire, but also an end to Israel's occupation. So, regarding today's event, on behalf of Salam, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar, commemorating the 13th anniversary of Bahrain's Pearl Roundabout Uprising, the commencement of mass popular protests which began on the 14th of February 2011 and form part of the broader Arab Spring movement that took place across the wider MENA region. Inspired by popular upheavals in Egypt and Tunisia, peaceful demonstrators took to the streets in their thousands, calling for substantive reforms on a wide variety of issues. This centered around major deficits of democratic processes in the country, as well as long-standing oppressive, systematic authoritarian practices perpetrated by the Bahraini authorities that severely constricted civic space. However, contrary to meeting the demands of the demonstrators and working to implement measures to ensure human rights and the democratic process receive better protection in Bahrain, the Bahraini authorities, alongside their close allies and neighbours, notably Saudi Arabia and the UAE, responded with a wave of violence and oppression, which led to protesters being arrested en masse, physically assaulted, tortured, and even killed. On the 2nd of July, a dialogue began between opposition and pro-government groups, and only 2 weeks later, the main Shiite opposition group, Al-Wafaq, announced it was pulling out, claiming its views and demands were not being taken seriously. Similarly, in September 2011, fewer than 1 in 5 voters cast ballots in by-elections. The Shiite majority largely boycotted the polls in protest again against the ongoing crackdown. So we are here today to discuss that historic moment and what transpired in the following years, and what can also be done to meaningfully promote rights in Bahrain 2020 and beyond. I'm delighted to be joined by an esteemed and who will each have between 7 minutes to make their remarks. To everyone in the audience, as we proceed, if you think of any questions you would like our panelists to answer, please feel free to type them in the chat box below, and I'll read them out, read out many of them as I can at the end during our Q&A session. So to begin with, I would like to introduce Syed Youssef Al-Mahafadha, a prominent Bahraini human rights activist, researcher, and blogger, currently living in exile in Germany as a result of his peaceful human rights work. It's a real pleasure to share the stage with you, Syed. To get things started today, I wanted to ask you if you could help provide some important context for us by giving your perspective on the events of 2011, as well as how things have changed on the ground in Bahrain over the course of the last 13 years, particularly in relation to issues addressed under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, such as those relating to public participation, political isolation, independent civil society, media, and so forth. Syed, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity provided by Salam to speak on the issue of depriving individuals of their civil and political rights, as well as criminalization of their guaranteed rights under restrictive laws, terrorist legislation, and other injustice status in Bahrain. And just to answer your question briefly, personally, I have participated in the peaceful movement or uprising in Bahrain in 2011 in MENA, and someone who has witnessed the events in 2011, I could say that it was a peaceful movement where the majority of the people in Bahrain went out to the street and called for democracy, elected government, released the political prisoner, and put an end to the discrimination against the majority Shia in Bahrain, equal citizenship, and gained some of their civil and political rights in Bahrain. The government has repeatedly suppressed the protest, where the Bahraini didn't achieve also their demands, and Bahrain, turned into a police state, where the government has eliminated all form of civic movement, expression, and anyone basically who oppose the government or criticize the government will be in jail or forced into exile like myself, or remain silent, as simple as it is. And also to answer the question of the event itself, do Bahraini have a voice? Absolutely no. Only the king, the government, military, and police, and anyone else, no. No one has any voice to speak in Bahrain. And also allow me now to present my paper, which I will demonstrate three fundamental rights which are under systematic violation by government, which is contrary to its obligation as a part of ICCPR. Over the past years, many demonstrations were suppressed and excessive force were employed by the security forces. However, not all protests were met with force. The new government adopted a new tactics. For example, following any unauthorized demonstration, security official may summon or arrest key activists within 24 to 48 hours of the event. The government consent details both participant and organizer of the government. With this approach, the Bahraini government not only sidestep, they only want to sidestep immediate criticism for the mass suppression of the press, but also instead it employs a strategy for participant identification, followed by post-event harassment through summons, for example, threats, arrests, interrogation, and many other forms of reprisal. So, speaking of association, following also the arbitrary reservation of Al-Wafaq Society, which you mentioned already, introduction, and Wa'ad and Amal Society, Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and also shutting down of Shia faith-based organization, also again a new tactics was used in terms of depriving individuals of their political and civil rights, which is the law 25/2018, which we call it as the activist isolation law, which target clearly members of previously dissolved political groups as well as former convicts. Even if an individual is condemned or convicted for exercising their political and civil rights, they are banned from being, for example, a board member of any society, and also being banned from running for the election in Bahrain. Additionally, also, the government employs, we call it kind of economic sanction by withholding what's so-called good conduct certificate, a good conduct certificate from this group, which is issued by the Ministry of Interior. These certificates are very crucial for various aspects of civic lives. However, former prisoners like Fadl Abbas, Ali Haji, and many others have waited for months or even years for this certificate to be issued. The 25/2018 law has severely impacted the operation of any civil society organization and charity organization as well, such as, for instance, Bahrain Human Rights Society, the Bahrain Women Union, and Bahrain Society for Resisting Normalization, all of which have struggled to maintain their activities in the face of these restrictive laws. So that's just a very brief introduction about the right of association and assembly. Going to the second point, which is freedom of speech, also numerous laws in Bahrain have violated severely freedom of expression, effectively violating critics of the government. These laws include the Penal Code, counterterrorism legislation, press and publication regulation, and cybercrime statutes. The government of Bahrain actively monitors content shared on social media platforms and takes punitive action against individuals who express decent opinion. Consequently, a significant number of individuals are currently imprisoned on charges related to freedom of expression until now. And the government of Bahrain applies this law indiscriminately against all forms of opposition and critics and human rights defenders. Cases well documented like Bir Rajab, Najah Youssef, Brahim Sharif, Muhammad Al-Ghasra, and Ali Muhanna were a clear example where individuals have been prosecuted for exercising their fundamental rights to freedom of expression. On the contrary, the government tolerates online and offline hate speech and racism against the British Shia in Bahrain or the opposition group, including to clear tweets that call for violence against them, despite also officially claims made by lawyer and individual. But unfortunately, they are protected, enjoying culture of impunity, which reflected a state divide policy, divide and rule. Thirdly, the right to life. Since 2011, Bahrain court have handed down death sentence to 51 individuals with 6 executions already carried out. As of February 2024, 26 men remain on death row. All have exhausted their avenues to appeal. All of these individuals also were subjected to unfair proceeding. The court relied heavily on testimony obtained through confession under torture, consisting a clear violation of several articles of ICCPR, Article 6 and 14 and 7. Bahraini courts have failed to uphold fundamental rights to fair trial guaranteed in both international convention and human rights law, as well as Bahraini constitution. To conclude, these restriction laws should not be used as a pretext to restrict the freedom of expression, freedom of association, and peaceful assembly, and the right to life. Finally, our recommendation to the government of Bahrain, they should abolish the 2018 political isolation law, put a stop to the practice of Ministry of Interior of rejecting certificate of good behavior in order to punish previous opponent, provide all Bahraini individuals full legal, civil, and political rights. It should also restore previously dissolved political and human rights society, which was mentioned, lift all restriction opposed opposition figure regarding candidates in parliamentary and municipal election, end the restrictive measures that are harming the basic functioning of civil association, and release all the prisoner of conscience, abolish the death penalty and be part of ICCPR optional protocol, and finally restore the nationality of all individuals whose nationality were arbitrarily revoked by the King, Court, and the Minister of Interior. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for illuminating remarks. And in fact, Jawad Fairuz, Salam's founder and chairman, is a victim of that last violation that you spoke about, that denationalisation. Yes, fascinating remarks. Thank you so much. It's clear that despite the appetite for reforms amongst the general population in Bahrain and amongst supporters worldwide, there is still so much work that needs to be done. So following on from Said's comments, we're now going to discuss some of the more involved measures that were implemented by the Bahraini authorities in response to the 2011 protests in order to address, or seemingly address, the fundamental grievances fueling the demonstrations. Such measures include the implementation of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, or the BISI, the National Human Rights Action Plan, as well as the creation of the National Institute for Human Rights and the introduction of ombudsmen. To provide more information on these measures, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague Falah Sayed. Falah is the Human Rights Officer at MENA Rights Group, and she worked with Salam previously on addressing the actions of such institutions. Falah, could you tell us a bit about these institutions and how effective they've actually been in practice, please? Thank you.
Of course, so much, Alex, and thank you to all the viewers who are listening to us. And thank you, Sayed, for your very insightful intervention. Yeah, I mean, as was brought up, 13 years ago in February, there was a wave of protests that swept across the Arab world, and obviously Bahrainis as well took to the streets to protest structural inequalities, corruption, oppression, lack of government representation, and amongst many other things. And in response, obviously, they were met with violence to suppress these protests. They were met with mass arrests, dozens of deaths, injuries, and so on. And in the aftermath of this mass protest, the government had to address some, international pressure regarding the mass abuses that were being committed. And so the government established the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry in June 2011 to investigate these government abuses, or seemingly, as you said, Alex, seemingly investigate the government abuses. And they implemented it by Royal Order number 28. The members of this commission were 5 very well-renowned international human rights experts, independent human rights experts, independent from the government. And it was tasked to determine whether the event involved violations of human rights law, and eventually make recommendations that it deemed appropriate. But what's important in this commission of inquiry is that beyond its investigative role, it actually had, an importance on another level, because it was going to provide a narrative around the events that were going to that happened in February 2011. And this Commission of Inquiry gave findings in November 2011. They published a report and they issued 26 recommendations to the government. They basically found that there was at least 19 individuals who were killed by authorities, that there was excessive use of force by security forces, that there was cases of torture, that thousands were arrested as well. They also, recorded that protest leaders and opposition figures were remain in prison after grossly unfair trials. So they issued these 26 recommendations after these findings, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of these recommendations were that to include, prompt investigation of all allegations of maltreatment. Removal of the National Security Intelligence Agency from the process of domestic law enforcement, relaxation of censorship, and allowing the political opposition access to the state-controlled media. These were actually the most important recommendations that were also found by Amnesty International. So I'll let Devin as well if he wants to add anything on it. So in 2016, funnily enough, the Bahrain government announced that it has officially implemented the 26 recommendations. However, civil society organizations found that only 2 recommendations were implemented. And even, one of the commissioners, Sharif Basyouni himself, said that barely 10 recommendations have been implemented. But anyways, if we take, 2 of the recommendations that were implemented, one of them is actually the creation of an independent oversight body to investigate allegations of torture. This was implemented, seemingly, obviously. Bahrain has established an ombudsman office and a National Institute of Human Rights, but neither of these institutions obviously are independent nor impartial. And the staff within these bodies are often former government employees, and these bodies are actually subordinate to the Special Investigations Unit, which has obviously a history of allegations or enacting reprisals against victims who file complaints of torture. I don't want to be too long, but I just wanted to speak about the National Institution for Human Rights, which is, the official NHRI of Bahrain. It's supposed to be an institution that's independent from the government. It's supposed to be this institution that actually holds the government accountable. Unfortunately, this is not at all the reality. Even the UN Human Rights Committee actually expressed its concern about this institution, and they said that it lacks the independence to perform its functions, and it regrets the lack of information on the complaints it has received. And on that issue, Salam, as you said, Alex, Salam and MENA Rights Group have actually published a report about this institution, where we actually found that this institution has consistently failed to address several human rights abuses, including some important legislations that enables the government to commit violations. And for instance, all the legislation that were brought up by Sayed, which I'm not going to go over again, none of them ended, none of them were addressed by the National Human Rights Institution, not the criminal codes, not the press law, not the isolation law, nothing. And even though these amendments were actually brought up by the Human Rights Committee, they said that the National Institution for Human Rights should, but they never did. We also is not as effective in practice as is claimed in some of their annual reports, because actually it's overactive in addressing the complaints, and they're being selective with actually a view to avoid holding the government accountable for violation of the fundamental rights that were mentioned as well by Sayed. And they're actually even, actively involved in covering it up or whitewashing the government's image in that sense. We also found that the visits organized to the 3 biggest prisons in Bahrain were insufficiently documented. They lacked transparency, and clearly they failed to identify issues that have been brought to our attention by civil society and international actors. We see that this institution actually does not address anything. And just to end my speech, not wanting to go too long, but we also found that the independence of this institution is clearly compromised, considering the fact that most of the members have held positions in parliament or in government. In fact, there was sufficient information that showed that current member actually lack the necessary expertise, and basically their appointment is just used as a ladder to get a higher position in government. And basically this institution actually operates in a context of just widespread human rights violation, and just where civic space is actually severely or not at all, severely restricted and completely non-existent.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fada. I think just to add to that, incredibly worrying though these trends are, I think it's important to say that they are by no means limited to Bahrain in the GCC. As we've seen Saudi Arabia's Human Rights Commission, for example, behaving in a very similar way to the institutions that you so eloquently described just there. I think whilst the creation of the BICI, the NIHR, etc., it's an indication of what can happen when the Bahraini authorities are placed under significant pressure to reform. But the fact that these institutions have been accused of whitewashing government abuses, like you say, I'm not going to repeat your words. This tells us that much more needs to be done going forward. So thank you so much, Falah, for your remarks. Another key tactic that is employed by the Bahraini authorities and their GCC counterparts is heavy investment in global entertainment, the art world, sports, and other spheres, which has increased in recent years. The end result of these tactics is that the world's attention is increasingly distracted away from human rights violations in Bahrain and across the GCC. Investments in sport have undoubtedly taken center stage in this regard, and Bahrain is no outlier here, as evidenced by its regular hosting of Formula One racing events, for example. So it's now my pleasure to introduce James Lynch, founding co-director of Fair Square. James, could you tell us a bit about the whitewashing tactics used by the Bahraini authorities, how effective you think they've been, and what can be done to counter these efforts? Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Salam, for the opportunity. Yeah, I mean, the commonly used term, which I'm sure lots of people are very aware of, is this term sports washing, which is pretty ill-defined, and it can mean a lot of different things depending on what country, what context you're talking about. There are different goals associated with it. But I think for the purposes of this conversation, I think what we're talking about is the use of either hosting sporting events or investing in sporting institutions outside the country, or sports sponsorship, to kind of project influence for political means, primarily led by, and it must be a state that's involved. So we're talking about political or economic means. I think one of the issues that comes up is that obviously sports washing does intersect with sort of more mainstream economic activities, diversification, for example, tourism, promotion. So it can be difficult to untangle, well, what here is political and what here is sort of normal economic behavior. Expanding the sports sector might make sense. I think in this case, what's really interesting is Bahrain was first out the gate in the Gulf to see the potential for sports. So it was 2004 that the Formula One was first held in Bahrain. And that's partly because, of course, Bahrain doesn't have the oil, the oil wealth or the gas wealth that most of its neighbors do. So it needed to start diversifying at an earlier stage. And obviously, Formula One is a really good way to promote yourself and make yourself a tourist destination, a business destination. These are big, glitzy events. As the repression in Bahrain has deepened over that 20-year period, and obviously we're talking today about 2011, which is maybe the high point or the low point of that repression. The sports have enabled Bahrain to kind of, it's what it does is it reduces the political cost of repression. That is for me the core element of sports washing. Now, and I think it's really important to say how important this is to the government. You can see it's still going to be important going forward. If you're looking at what the infrastructure projects the governments are planning, they're planning an international sports city. So this is supposed to be completed in 2025. So this isn't the kind of a legacy thing. This is something that the government sees as a future plan. I just wanted to take a quick look at, talk briefly about how this is sort of played out in Formula One, with horse racing, with football, and then a brief look at darts as well, which I think is quite an interesting thing to look at. Formula One is really where the main action has been. That is the centerpiece of Bahrain's involvement in sport. I think one thing I want to flag here is that I think quite a lot of Bahrain's involvement in sport, there seems to be a very deliberate UK angle, and I think that's not insignificant. The UK, as people will know, is probably, is a key strategic, military and economic and political partner for Bahrain, that kind of has Bahrain's back and has done for many years. So it's therefore, and yet that partnership is quite controversial in the UK because of the work of NGOs like Salam and Bird and many others, and Amnesty International and others, to highlight the repression and the abuses in Bahrain. So there is a real need to find ways of kind of making sure that that partnership doesn't become overly controversial and contested within the UK. So I think quite a lot of these sports, Formula One, people will know, had a big background and history in the UK. A lot of the teams come out of the UK. Formula One, the organization itself, has a kind of background in the UK. So that's where a lot of people in the UK will know Bahrain, through the Grand Prix. And it's a big event. It's 100,000 people who come. And recently, Bahrain just signed on for that Formula One race till 2026. That, I think, is the longest deal that's ever been done in the history of the sport. It's a highlight the importance of that for Bahrain. You also have Mumtalakat, the sovereign wealth fund, also has a controlling stake in McLaren. I think that's which is one of the teams that is in Formula One. I think it would be important to say that while Bahrain really benefits from the glitz and the glamour and the promotion, the kind of circus that comes every year with Formula One, the access that gives you to these devoted fans, because Formula One does, unusually really, outside football, it's probably one of the most voted sort of bases. People are very, 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 very committed to their Formula One team. But despite those opportunities, this has not been uncontested. What we always see with these big events is that on one hand, they do help to reduce the political consequences, but they also open up a space for campaigners and advocates to highlight to highlight abuses, and we've seen that repeatedly with Formula One. And I think, you know, there's been a lot of pushback. You've even had, you know, Lewis Hamilton expressing his concerns, and this is quite an unusual thing to get any athlete, a current athlete of that significance, to actually speak out on human rights abuses is extremely unusual. And that's, of course, I think that's the campaigners who've worked on that, you know, need a lot of credit for their efforts. There's also been, you know, the Formula One is facing a complaint at the OECD, the national contact point, because of the fact of its failure to address human rights issues directly linked to the races. There's been a number of cases where Bahrainis have protested against the event and then been arrested themselves and then faced torture. So I think that for Formula One itself, Formula One only has a human rights policy because of the Bahrain Grand Prix. So these things they can be a double-edged swords for repressive states who want to use big events. And of course, you know, we saw that a lot of people accuse Qatar of having a World Cup to improve its reputation. Depending on where you were on the world, that wasn't really how it looked. Actually, that the tournament in many ways was not good for Qatar's reputation at all. I think I just wanted to quickly turn to the horse racing. I think is really significant because it's a very different form of use of sport. This is where every year the royal family of Bahrain is very involved in the Royal Windsor Horse Show. You know, they host events such as the King's Cup. Prince Nasser has participated, a very, you know, well-known figure to people in the human rights community. And it was very common for the king to be pictured with Queen Elizabeth before her death. So what you're getting there is these high-level personalized connections. I think that's something that often gets forgotten. You know, I think people, when, for example, we talk about, you know, the ownership by the UAE of Manchester City Football Club, I think people often forget about the opportunities that presents for Mohammed bin Zayed to sit next to Erdogan at the Champions League final and to do business, you know, and to forge connections onto the world and use those as symbolism as well. So I think we shouldn't forget the importance of the royal box or the VIP box in these stadiums. These are very important. So briefly on football, Bahrain has had a slightly more spotty relationship with football. It has not worked as well, you know, is broadly speaking. You know, people will remember that there was an attempt to actually get Sheikh Salman to be the president of FIFA. That didn't happen, and part of the reason that didn't happen, he lost to Infantino, was because of the massive focus on his role in 2011, you know, and his role in the abuse of athletes at that time. Now it's worth saying, of course, he is still the head of the Asian Football Confederation, and he's just helped make sure that the 2034 World Cup is going to Saudi Arabia, so he's still very much in the picture. Beyond that, of course, people will remember the shocking case of Hakeem Al Arabi, the Bahraini footballer who Bahrain tried to extradite from Thailand. He was living as a refugee in Australia, and it was and again, this was where it really didn't work for Bahrain. This was a case where they were trying to tell the world, you know, this guy is a criminal, but in fact, his alibi was that at the time of the supposed crime that he committed, he was playing a football match live on TV. So again, Bahrain has had this not a great relationship in some ways with football. And in terms of, it's also had within the UK a couple of quite, you know, a disastrous experience with Wigan Athletic Football Club, where it hasn't worked out at all. So again, it's not something that always works perfectly, I think is what I would say. I just wanted to touch on darts because I think, because people will probably know that there was, or some people may know that there was a really major tournament held in Bahrain very recently, for the second year in a row. And darts is interesting because it's very, very big in the UK. It appeals to almost a completely different demographic from, for example, horse racing. It's a really popular sport. And I think what we see here, it's a little bit like the way that Saudi Arabia is going after football and golf for different demographics. You're going for different. With Bahrain going for darts, I mean, what you are really tapping into there is a deeper, not particularly a politicized part of or a part of the British population that's heavily invested in foreign policy. So this is about kind of broadening out the awareness of Bahrain and building that legitimacy. So I think what I wanted to just finish with was your question, Alex, was, has this worked? That's an absolute kind of rapid run through. I think it is a mixed picture. On the one hand, these events can be a lightning rod for citizens and advocates to, they provide an opening, and it brings, I think it brings Formula One and organizations like it, international organizations, into the scope of human rights workers, activities. It creates new kinds of advocacy targets that don't exist otherwise. So on that, you could argue that it hasn't been that successful. I think there is a bigger picture, though, is that I think most people who follow these sports will not necessarily be aware of these discussions. Even Formula One fans may not be aware really about Lewis Hamilton's comments unless these things are getting covered. Unless these things are getting covered by the sports media. I mean, and I think that's what was interesting in 2011 and 2012. The actual Formula One journalists were covering discussions about whether the event should be held in Bahrain or not. More recently, I think these things are often covered more from a foreign policy angle. So it's about trying to get into the sport coverage. So I do think they have had some success in reducing those political costs of repression. I think in terms of what needs doing, I think it's about holding to account these organizations that are making money through these links to Bahrain and not doing their own due diligence, not holding their Bahraini partners to account. The Professional Darts Corporation, what can we do to kind of put them under pressure for next year's event? Thanks. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, James. I think it's critical that as many people as possible are made aware of the tactics being employed by authoritarian governments such as Bahrain. Of course, it's not limited to the GCC, but those which misdirect international attention from issues like arbitrary arrest, torture, and enforced disappearance of peaceful dissidents. More awareness undoubtedly increases the likelihood of action being taken to solve it, not just amongst civil society, but amongst concerned members of the population more broadly as well. So thank you for providing such important information on that subject. It's greatly appreciated. Another important aspect of this conversation is the support, as James mentioned, that Bahrain receives from its international allies. Now, in my introduction, I mentioned how its regional partners, so Saudi Arabia and the UAE most notably, helped suppress the protests in 2011. However, the wide-ranging support that Bahrain's ruling Al Khalifa family receives from such states as the UK and the United States is arguably much more important. The UK and US have long-standing relationships with all 6 Gulf monarchies, including Bahrain, with arms sales and various military ties, including training programs, and for many years, oil imports at the heart of these arrangements. Intelligence sharing and Bahraini investment in the UK have also become increasingly important in recent decades too. And furthermore, the extent of arms and surveillance technology sales, as well as meetings between the respective royal families, again, which James touched on, increased significantly in the years following 2011. So to provide more information on these issues, in particular those relating to arms sales, is Katie Fallon, Advocacy Manager at Campaign Against the Arms Trade. Katie, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Could you tell us about the nature of UK Bahraini arms sales, in particular since 2011, please?
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much, Alex, and to the other speakers for their comments so far, and for painting a real thorough picture of where we are. So yes, my name is Katie. I'm Advocacy Manager at Campaign Against Arms Trade, also known as CAT. We're a UK-based organisation working to end the international arms trade. And our priorities are to stop arms exports where they exacerbate conflict, support an oppressive regime, or break international law, which unfortunately we're increasingly seeing. It's not just violations of international humanitarian law, but war crimes, particularly in the Middle East. So in February 2011, mass pro-democracy protests were violently suppressed by the Bahraini regime. And following the crackdown, hundreds of people were unjustly detained, some of whom are still in prison. To this day, Freedom House ranks Bahrain as not free, and in 2023 only scored 12 out of 100 across political rights and civil liberties. Yet the UK has continued to export arms to Bahrain throughout this entire period before and after 2011. It is often listed as a core market for UK arms sales. That's up to 2020, despite its human rights record, which you've just heard in great detail is extremely concerning. So in the last decade alone, the UK has issued licenses for over 181 million worth of arms to Bahrain. And this is in addition to 80 open licenses for unlimited items. So that number of 181 million over the past 10 years, it's really important to highlight that that's actually that could be even only half of the amount. We tend to see that it can be about half between the single licenses and the open licenses. And that's because this system is constructed to avoid transparency. So for the open licenses, the UK government doesn't record what is actually exported, where it ends up, how much, if any. It'll be a long list of items with no information provided on the other side. So just to highlight that number is just the bare minimum of what's being exported. The single licenses include ML10 licenses for aircrafts, helicopters and drones, ML1, which is for small arms, that's for 29 million, ML3, grenades, bombs, missiles and countermeasures, that's also 29 million, ML5, so this is target acquisition, weapon control, countermeasure systems, 21 million, and ML9 for warships of 15 million, just on those single licenses. So UK arms exports were temporarily withdrawn in 2011 after public outcry. But of course, business as usual returned, everything turned to normal as soon as possible. And we've been exporting ever since. This has included other UK sales have included fighter trainer aircraft and transport aircrafts. And there was an unsuccessful but major push to sell the Eurofighter Typhoon combat aircrafts to Bahrain in 2013. The UK government has provided training to the Bahraini military and security forces. And I think something that's kind of already been touched on by some of the other speakers, and when James was speaking about sports washing, the UK has really renewed its military involvement in the Persian Gulf over the last 10 years. And, you know, this has been described by our partners War on Want as a new British imperialism. And I think that particularly kind of speaks to, for instance, horse shows, arms fairs in the UK, where there's always been a strong Bahraini presence, and that allows again for that person-to-person contact, not just the exports themselves, but the kind of political capital that it buys to be in those arenas at that time. So this relationship, and particularly the business interests of arms companies and their impact of lobbying the government, has led the government here to offer uncritical support to the Bahraini regime. And at times when it should have been condemned and isolated for its crackdown, the relationship between the government here and the Bahraini regime has actually just been tightened. So we're seeing this even, for instance, and this might have been mentioned already, that Bahrain was listed as a human rights priority country by the Foreign Office up to 2021. And then just recently, and to my knowledge, also in addition to a massive investment here in the UK, I think was it, maybe someone else can give the figure, but it was millions, if not $1 billion. And that coincides at the same time where it's been moved from this human rights priority list. The entire time it's been on the list, we've also been exporting arms. So that didn't, even though, you know, it's being classified by our own Foreign Office that sign off on these arms exports, arms export licenses, that isn't enough. It's not taken into account. And it cannot be forgotten that people have been in prison since 2011 to this day, are still there, while our government has allowed that to continue and reinforces the militarism with these arms sales. I think something else to point out in addition to, so there was a UK military base in 2018, COP26, for example, invitation to royal horse shows that have already been mentioned. And just in recent weeks, I think it's notable and worth pointing out that Bahrain was the only country in the Middle East that supported the joint US-UK airstrikes against the Houthis in the Red Sea. And, we at CAT, we have a statement on our website explaining our position on this, but it's kind of, I think, and this was already said as well, not supporting without question the Bahraini government. It's buying Bahrainis' support for UK military intervention in the Middle East, even though there was no parliamentary scrutiny of these, and they have yet to be, they've continued the second round of joint US and UK airstrikes in an already frightening and escalatory environment. And having a country in the Middle East who will support that is a useful ally to have. So despite the fact that we keep being told that this relationship will build a strong human rights context in Bahrain, it's actually being manipulated on both sides to excuse actions that should never be taking place. And if anyone has any questions, I'll finish there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katie. I think the relationship that Bahrain has with states such as the UK, and the core aspects of these relationships, which undoubtedly include the sale of arms, like you mentioned, the training of Bahraini police, security, military personnel, etc. It's arguably the main reason why the Bahraini government has been able to resist democratic transition for so long. And just touching on what you mentioned at the end there about the close nature of UK Bahraini ties, which the UK government continuously says this allows us to raise sensitive issues with our Bahraini counterparts and pursue progressive human rights reforms. I mean, if you take, for example, the Gulf Strategy Fund, this murky body which nobody really knows too much about across the GCC. This is not just an issue that is isolated to Bahrain. I mean, as you know, and of course, Bird have done a lot of work on this as well. Many people have attempted to yield some information from the government on this matter to reveal the extent of the partnership, to show what all of this supposedly progressive, positive change that the UK is attempting to implement through these measures, which ultimately falls on deaf ears constantly. And Bird did a fantastic report, in fact, a couple of years back, covering what was then the Integrated Activity Fund and is now the Gulf Strategy Fund. So I'd encourage everyone interested to go and have a read of that. It's really excellent.
Thanks, Alex. Just to add, I think we really need to be looking at the government's foreign policy holistically across multiple countries in the Middle East. And, on our work, when we're looking at the minute, not just CAP, but like many partners, many MPs working in Parliament to get answers on what the government is asking Israel, what assurances they've been given, kind of to tie into what you're saying about, these close relationships allow us to push apparently a human rights agenda. But the reality is it's actually being used to use it. And we're also not getting answers to well thought out, clear questions from people that understand the system, that we're really just being stonewalled. So it cannot be the case that the relationships that are built on arms trade, where, then when something serious happens, we're not seeing any real progress or any transparency to the public of what's being done in our name. And it's a mutually enforcing, I think, like I pointed out with Bahrain supporting those airstrikes in Yemen.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just, I guess, one final comment from me, particularly on like the GSF. I think the worrying links between the funds that have been provided to the Bahraini authorities and individuals who have gone on to torture dissidents, for example. I mean, you can draw a very clear line between one and the other. That, again, it raises a very serious question mark about the progressive, positive nature of this close relationship that the UK claims it has with Bahrain. So, yeah, thank you so much, Katie. That was very very illuminating. Following on from remarks made by several of our panelists today, especially Syed Youssef, regarding information on the ground and the treatment of those seeking to peacefully voice dissenting opinions, I'd now like to introduce Devin Kenny, who is the GCC researcher at Amnesty International. Devin, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to ask you, building on the remarks of your fellow panelists, how the nature of persecution of people seeking their civil and political rights in Bahrain has changed since 2011, and how have you changed over the course of the last decade or so? And additionally, what would your analysis be of the current state of freedom of expression in Bahrain, or lack thereof?
Thank you, Alex, and thanks to Salam and to the other panelists. Between 2011 and now, there's been, I would say, just one significant change in the patterns of persecution or the patterns of, which is that there's been a decline in the number of allegations of torture. So that is a change for the better. In 2011 and the years right after, there was a major spike in torture as the government clamped down brutally on the protests that year. But within the past, I would say roughly 4 years, all the indications I've received are that torture has declined. I would point in this regard to an instance in February 2021, when the Crown Prince Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa, who's also the Prime Minister, gave an interview to all the controlled local news outlets in Bahrain. And in the interview, he stressed, and I'm quoting here from the text of the interview given by the local paper Al Ayam, quote, "The importance of starting to move past the method of relying on confessions in court and relying instead on decisive material evidence." My reading of this is that the Crown Prince was referring pretty obviously, albeit not explicitly, to the use of torture and confessions extracted through torture, and was announcing that there's been a government decision to move away from it as a common practice and policy. You know, in the natural course of things, it would be pretty odd for most people to confess against themselves if it meant going to prison, and it would be even more odd if a legal system were getting all these amazing confessions out of hardened criminals. So the constant reliance up until about 2017, 2018 in Bahrain's court system and in the most high-profile political cases on confessions, quote-unquote confessions as a key element of evidence, was on its face extremely problematic and suspicious. And, you know, historically, if you look at the use of confession, quote unquote, as a primary form of criminal evidence, it has tended to be linked closely to the use of torture, or at least maltreatment, as the main tool for making a criminal case. So I think that around the years 2018 to 2012, or excuse me, 2018 to 2020, the Bahraini government decided that they would move away from torture as a regular tool of repression, and that the Crown Prince's interview was the public announcement of this shift. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen anymore. There was an instance of maltreatment just last year that was publicly documented at the time of the mass prison hunger strike. It also doesn't mean that it can't be brought back as a regular policy, or wouldn't be brought back if the government felt that its hold on power was threatened. But for now, there's been a decline in that regard. Other than that, though, the nature of persecution, I don't think has really changed from 2011 until now. The government's principal tools are the standard ones: arbitrary detention, prosecution for opposition speech or protest, and imprisonment. And, you know, the main legacy of repression from 2011 that is still visible and is still affecting Bahraini politics today is the ongoing imprisonment of 11 key political leaders of those protests. Originally, they were 14, but over time, the number has changed. Some were released, another one went in. So rather than trying to refer to this group by number, I think it makes more sense to refer to this group by the local term that's commonly used, which is Rumuz, which means basically just like the leaders or the leading figures. So yeah, as of today, the Rumuz group are 11 key political leaders. 10 of them have been in prison from 2011, and out of those, 7 have life sentences. And so there's just no expectation that they will be released at all ever unless political conditions change. Along with those 10 from 2011 directly, we should also count Sheikh Ali Salman among this group, the Rumuz. Ali Salman was not taken into prison until 2015, but his case is very much linked with the events of 2011. And it's also very illustrative of how Bahrain chose the path of repression from 2011 onwards. So I'll focus on that case specifically for a couple moments here. Ali Salman was and is the leader of Al-Wifaq, which is the major opposition party in Bahrain. To this day, it's still the single most successful political party in Bahrain under the current constitution, meaning it's won the highest number of seats in the Bahraini parliament of any participating party in any election held under the current constitution when it was participating in elections. And the major debate within the Bahraini opposition has always been whether to try and use the government's political channels to seek change or to boycott official institutions completely. When there was some liberalization in Bahrain in the first decade of this millennium, before 2011, Al-Wifaq chose to try the path of participation in the existing system, including in elections. So they chose to play the political game according to the rules that the government sets and try to get positive change that way. And this cost them. In fact, it fractured their movement, and the more radical faction within Al-Wifaq broke away into its own movement, Haq, which held to the line of boycotting government institutions and elections. So Al-Wifaq, led by Ali Salman, this prisoner, paid a real social and political cost for making this choice to try and work for change within the system. And yet, after 2011, in which they were active in the mass protests, Al-Wifaq and Ali Salman, after 2011, and specifically in the period 2015 to 2017, the Bahraini government, in effect, finalized its post-2011 crackdown, or put the finishing touches on it, by outlawing Al-Wifaq as a party and by imprisoning Ali Salman for life. So that was a choice for repression, clearly, and it's one that unfortunately is still in effect today and will probably continue to damage Bahraini politics and society for another generation, at least. To the second question, or the second part of your question about status of freedom of expression today, the biggest political development in Bahrain within the past year has been the emergence of protests, first in solidarity with Gaza and Palestine, and then more recently against the government's joining the US's naval actions against the Houthis in Yemen. And this has included protests in the capital, Manama, which used to be a red line for the government. So what's interesting to me and what I would note in this regard is that Bahrain still hasn't revoked the law that outright bans all unapproved peaceful assemblies in the capital. That was passed as Decree of Act number 22 of 2013, and it's still there. So if the government and the authorities are allowing protests to happen in Manama today without dispersing them, that's a political decision and not a legal change. And this indicates that the government continues to view rights as a matter to be determined according to its political convenience rather than as a fundamental legal principle. So yeah, those are my remarks on what's changed and what's stayed the same over the past decade, or more than a decade, 13 years now.
Thank you so much, Devin, for those helpful comments, and especially for drawing attention to the ongoing plight of the leaders of the Bahraini opposition, or many of them at least, such as Hassan Mushaima, Abdul Hadi Khawaja, and indeed, as you mentioned, Sheikh Ali Salman as well. I think it's critical that we continue to raise these cases and the egregious symptomatic violations that are associated with them. So moving on now to our final speaker. As Katie has already discussed in today's event, particularly from an arms sales or military perspective, the UK has played a significant role in supporting Bahrain's ruling Al Khalifa family for many years now. And as we know, the close, long-standing relationship the UK has with Bahrain has a wide variety of parts to it. To provide something of an insider's perspective on this and discuss the nature of the UK-Bahrain relationship, given his experience working in the UK Parliament, I am delighted to introduce Martyn Day, Scottish National Party MP for Linlithgow and East Falkirk. Thank you so much for joining us today, Martyn. I just wanted to ask you, what is your assessment of the UK's role in supporting Bahrain, again, particularly since 2011? Practically, what should the UK be doing in order to apply more pressure to its Bahraini counterparts to implement these sort of meaningful reforms that have been discussed today? And also, how can we, so those of us who aren't MPs, apply meaningful pressure to the UK government to reform its own policy on Bahrain parliamentarily or otherwise? Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Alec, and it's a real pleasure to join such an august panel tonight. I feel like the weak link in the chain in terms of knowledge on Bahrain compared to the other experts that you've had on. However, the human rights situation is one that has concerned me for a number of years since I entered Parliament, and I've asked repeatedly questions of government on a range of countries, Bahrain being one that I've taken an interest in, because I think the sheer scale of political prisoners was what highlighted something's wrong there to me. And I have to say, I've not been satisfied with the answers I've received over that period. So in short, to the first part of your question, how do I assess the UK's role? I would say, sadly, I have to say complicit is my assessment in one word, basically. And we've seen so many mechanisms over that period, whether it was the integrated activity fund, which became the Gulf Strategy Fund, very opaque, very cloak and dagger, mostly money going to Saudis, but also we think probably around 13 million went into Bahrain. Very difficult to get accurate details of just what it's been spent on. But we do know that money has been used supporting different things that we probably wouldn't think money should be supporting. I mean, one example is we know it helped fund the Bahraini Ombudsman, which, the UN Committee Against Torture labelled as neither effective nor independent. So why are we funding aspects like that? We could go on all night with examples of what we think it's been spent on. So I think we need to bring real pressure to bear on transparency in terms of the UK support there. I mean, we should have a detailed publication of just where our money is spent, and there should be a human rights appraisal on the projects that it's supporting. I think that would be a simple way of getting some form of transparency and pressure brought on. I get kind of stock answers from ministers and to various questions that I've asked over the period, and I've scribbled down three. So this is me summarising. I get told the sort of the most. Is that they regularly discuss human rights issues with their Bahraini counterparts. Words to that effect, the wording changes in different answers, but that's the gist. And the other is that they tell me that they think their Bahraini allies are making consistent and systematic progress. And I just don't see it. In fact, I some of if it's progress, it's as much use as a chocolate teapot. It's just not satisfactory. So how do we get it to do more? And I think we need to be putting in a bit of a stronger hand. Now, we've got long links with Bahrain. Indeed, perhaps some of the legacy of the problems are to do with British links. I mean, I learned last year a figure in history which our Bahraini friends will know the background to, but I hadn't heard of a fellow Scot by the name of Ian Henderson, who's basically set up the torture and oppressive regime that's still continued to this day. So kind of stain on my own country's reputation there, but one that we need to try and address. So I think in addition to getting published figures of where our money is going on the projects, we should be pushing our UK's representatives through the government to get the UN Human Rights Council to pass a resolution about human rights violations in Bahrain, and we should be looking for a UN-led commission to investigate the allegations of torture and to look at the prison population. I never cease to be dumbfounded by just the scale of the prison population in Bahrain per head, more prison population than anywhere else in the world. You know, I come from a small country, Scotland, 5.5 million, and our total prison population is about 8,000, and we don't have any political prisoners. So, you know, that puts it into perspective that you have a situation that's somewhere around 1 in 500 of the population are a political prisoner in Bahrain. You know, so we need to be bringing pressure to bear on our government. And, you know, that brings me on to the main part of your question. You know, what can we do to do that? You know, there are a number of us in Parliament, cross-party, that are asking questions of government on a fairly regular basis, and we need to keep doing that, and we could do with probably a bit of support. This is an observation, and I can't really say what the current situation is because I no longer get this attention, shall we say. But when I was first elected and I started asking questions, I did notice that the Bahraini regime was very averse to public criticism. And indeed, they would regularly get in touch with me to discuss what I'd asked, or they even on occasions flew people across specifically to speak to me. They've kind of given up doing that, which maybe means they've written me off as someone they can't soft soap anymore. But I suspect if we can encourage other MPs that haven't spoken on the matter to get involved, they will start paying attention to them as well and put a bit more pressure on, and also to put pressure on the UK government to take a stiffer line. So I think basically if we have sympathetic people in constituencies, that they should write to their own MP and ask them to ask a question, particularly I think around the one for me is obviously the political prisoners. You know, we need to be asking why the UK is supporting such a strong ally when it has such an appalling record on political detention, torture, and use of the death penalty. So, you know, these are all things that the UK government is stated to be opposed to. So let's put pressure on the government to bring some pressure to bear on its ally. And I think that's where we've got soft power. You know, we should be bringing real pressure to bear, not just lip service. And I was dumbfounded when Bahrain was removed from the list of human rights concerned countries because, you know, the fundamental position hasn't changed. So that's just madness in my eyes. So it should be back on that list, in my opinion. Or, you know, I would, if they'd like to meet us halfway and release the political prisoners, I think we could then justify them not being on the list. So we need to be sending very strong messages, and there are different routes that we can do to do that. You know, before I came online tonight, I was looking to see, and it's been a couple of years since we've had a debate in Parliament, so we need to start applying, I think, for another debate to draw attention to the current situation. Another vehicle that people can do, and as I say, if the Bahraini regime is still a bit averse to bad press, then perhaps we should be encouraging, where we have supportive constituents of other members, encouraging them to present public petitions in Parliament. Can you imagine the effect if 100 members got up one night in that 20-minute slot and presented the same opinion, public petition, you know, condemning the regime for its political prisoners? That would have a massive PR effect. I saw it done a number of years ago for the WASPI women. Massive amount of press coverage and a huge amount of parliamentary awareness was generated just by the sheer volume of people who were contacting their MP and giving them basically the same petition. And, you know, it had to be choreographed by the clerks to get everybody done in that 20-minute slot, but by gosh, it had an impact. So there's things there that we need to be thinking of doing to, I think, to use the system we've got. I hope that's helpful, and I'm more than happy to take questions. I work better when I'm busking, so, you know, and I'm used to getting heckled, so feel free to fire anything at me.
Thank you so much, Martyn. The work of parliamentarians such as yourself, who are genuinely concerned about human rights in Bahrain and willing to act on their convictions and principles, is invaluable. And I would like to thank you not only for your remarks, but also for your ongoing efforts to hold the UK authorities to account in this regard. It is, you know, you're doing a genuine service here, and I thank you for that. Yeah, I'm sure you've given everyone on this call today some food for thought about how they, whether in the human rights and political sectors or not, can help promote human rights and democracy in Bahrain. So that brings us to an end of the main aspect of this event today. I'm just gonna open things up in terms of the Q&A. But before I do that, I would also like to introduce to everyone an old colleague of mine, Dr. Saeed Shahabi, with whom I worked a couple of years ago when I was interning at Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain. Saeed, it's a real pleasure to have you on the call today. And if you would like to answer any of these questions, which are going to come up, please feel free to do so. It'll be a real privilege and an honor to hear what you have to say. So if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. I have a few of my own, but yeah, I mean, Saeed, if you'd like to say anything, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Alex and Martyn. It's a pleasure to see you and all the speakers, Katie and Devin, and also James, and of course, Said Yusuf. You have said wonderful things, and this is really motivating to hear the degree of details that you have presented and the passion that you have expressed. It really gives me a motivation to do more. The situation in Bahrain is very complicated, very difficult. Somebody, I don't recall, I think Devin was talking about torture, and that it may have become less than before, but of course that is because generally the activism has become much less than before, although it is continuing almost on daily basis. But today, just before I joined here, I saw a young boy of 16 years of age. He's on the Twitter, and he was describing how he was tortured in the last few days only. And his name is, anyway, he's on Twitter. His name is, what's his name? Ali Abdullah. And the human rights activist Ibtisam al-Sayer had published his testimony, or his about 2 minutes speech, a clip, in which he described vividly what happened to him recently. He's a very small boy. So torture is a tool that cannot be that cannot be ignored by the regime. This is the only way he can silence people, is by creating fear in the minds and hearts of people, that if they are arrested, they will be humiliated, they will be tortured. So this is a hindrance in the face of the people. Anyway, I think Martyn has a great role to play, because we believe that the most important and significant support of the regime comes from the UK, past and the present. You just saw, I also sent you this Ian Henderson. This is at the airport. He passed away, I think, 2014 or 2015. He's no longer in this life. But this, I caught him at the airport 2006 or 7, when I chatted with him and took this image of him. He was notorious. But this is only an indication of the extent of the UK's involvement in Bahrain. It is still ongoing in terms of security support and also in terms of political support. So, Martyn, you have an uphill struggle to convince I don't know who's after James Cleverly, I don't recall who's the foreign minister here, the foreign secretary.
It's now controversially Lord Cameron, so it's difficult.
Oh yes.
But yes.
So we shouldn't expect much different from James Cleverly. But this is your job, and your colleague's job, to challenge these people that it is not in the interest of the UK to continue supporting dictatorship and torturers. Anyway, I just like to thank you all, and I have really made a lot of effort to be here, but I benefited from your speeches all. Thank you all. Thank you, Alex, and thank you all of you. And have a nice weekend. Unfortunately, I have to leave because I have an interview just now, 5:20. So I thank you again, and I hope to see you soon. I also sent a seminar that we have on Monday. If any of you can make it, we'll be grateful to see you to mark the 13th anniversary of the revolution. Okay, have a good day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Said. It's great to see you.
It's a pleasure.
So, yeah, I mean, as far as this part of the event goes, I'm very aware that we don't have too much time. But if anyone does have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat box. Like I say, I have one or two that I'd be interested to get the panel's thoughts on. One element that I did want to raise today is the issue of women's rights in Bahrain. Women formed an integral part of the pro-democracy movement, and countless women's rights activists were imprisoned and subjected to a wide variety of human rights violations as a result of their organizing and their participation in the demonstrations. Said Youssef, I guess you'd probably be the best place to speak about this, if you may. Could I ask you, like, if you could say a few words about the current state of women's rights in Bahrain? Has there been any change over the last decade or so? What's the situation?
Yes, thank you very much. And I think the situation of women rights defender is getting worse. And already I have mentioned also at the beginning of my paper some of the restriction on civil society, including women society organization, and Zainab al-Drazi, for example, in particular, who have been also the political isolation law was imposed on her and to prevent her from working. And in general, also, there are many other human rights violations, including, for example, the woman in Bahrain, for example, she cannot transfer the citizenship to her husband if she is married to non-Bahraini. And also there are many other, for example, women rights defender, such as Ibtisam al-Sayed, Zainab al-Khwaja. She is in exile because of her human rights activity, and also a lot of harassment against Ibtisam al-Sayed. And Maryam al-Khawaja, for example, she had been persecuted, sentenced. She lives in exile. She was not allowed to come back to Bahrain a few months ago. And so I think the situation against women rights defender, it's getting worse. Nothing get better since 2011 until now. And there are many restrictions on women activities in Bahrain. I don't want to be very long, so I know we have only a few minutes. I have a lot to say about women, but just very quick, briefly about women rights defender in Bahrain.
Thank you so much, Syed. We've just received a question in the chat from Drury. The European Parliament elections will take place this year. Can participants comment on how we can, I think, is that get the forthcoming parliamentarians to take Bahrain seriously? What do activists need to say or highlight? So I think this is with specific regard to the European Parliament elections coming up this year. If anyone has any comments on that. Drury, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and reword that if I've not worded that correctly. Okay, great. Yeah, I don't know if anyone does have any comments on that. If not, I have one final one for everyone, just to pick up on an aspect that Martyn addressed in his remarks. If I could sort of ask the entire panel, from a pragmatic standpoint, because I think there's a real importance that needs to be placed on forward thinking here. It's incredibly important to maintain a level of cognizance about what's happened in the past, but also to think about what practically can be done now to yield some kind of positive impact for people who continue to face a wide variety of rights violations in Bahrain. So from your standpoint, as people who work in the human rights sector in various capacities, sorry, would you want to add something? Oh, never mind. What steps can people who are not human rights activists or parliamentarians take to make this meaningful, positive impact on human rights and democratic transition in Bahrain? I mean, Martyn mentioned a few kind of parliamentary mechanisms, whether it's petitions, written questions, etc. I was just wondering if anyone has any suggestions based on their work and experience about what people who don't work in our sectors could usefully do.
Well, I think, Alex, I mean, in a way, I suppose I would say one simple thing people can do is help people like Martyn, right? I think parliamentarians insist in sort of proper democratic systems, parliamentarians, they actually need their constituents to ask them about things and take an interest and to give them the motivation and the basis to work on things. And I think the more that parliamentarians are asked about Bahrain, the better it will be, whether that's in the UK or elsewhere. And I think that's how we can begin to build pressure and keep this on the agenda of foreign ministries, make it difficult for them to avoid scrutiny. I think that's going to be a key starting point.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. Rena, did you want to add something?
Thank you, Alex, and I congratulate you all, Salam, and you, Alex, and everyone, for this very, very helpful and very valuable symposium. I want to answer to your last question. I want to take the example of what's going on in Gaza right now. Since 75 years ago, these same crimes, war crimes, were committed by Israel, still going on. I remember them as an infant from South Lebanon. I lived this trauma. But what's changed now is social media. We should take into consideration very highly the media of the individuals. In past years, in past decades, mainstream media did not convey the truth about what was going in Palestine or was going anywhere in the Middle East. In Bahrain, the same thing should happen. The media of the individual, people should convey what's actually going on. Every individual can do that. I want to say here, for an example, Hakim al-Uraibi was saved by the people of Australia. How did that happen? Hakim al-Uraibi was a footballer. When he went to Australia, he used to play with the Australian football teams. When he was detained in Thailand, it was the Australian football fans who used to raise his pictures in matches, and so it was their pressure on their government that saved him. We, as human rights activists, based on our experience, we believe in the people, in the power of the people. We believe that people actually care, but if they don't know, how will they act? So it's after they know, and for them to know, people should convey to them. Social media should work its role. So all Bahraini people, all people who know about these issues, what's going on in Bahrain, should deliver all this information. I just want, in 1 minute, less than 1 minute, also to shed the light upon the military prisons in Bahrain. Sadly, there are civilians, people who are not associated with any military actions, that are imprisoned in the military prison, namely 4 prisoners of conscience right now. They have been in prison since less than a decade ago. I cannot recall exactly the exact date. They are still in prison. This is also a case that should be that the light should be shed upon. More, I don't want to say more than any other case in Bahrain, but other prisoners of conscience, their information from inside prison are being let out. We know what's happening with them. Sometimes they can get contact with human rights activists, with their families. Prisoners of conscience in military prisons are really suffering, and it is very difficult to get information from them. That's all I wanted to say, and thank you very much.
No, no problem at all, Rena. That's very enlightening. Yeah, and I agree with you about the utilization of social media. I think that that's something which we in 2024 have at our disposal that people in the past didn't. And you know, it's a real unifying tool, as we've seen, as you mentioned, in relation to things currently going on in Gaza. There's no question that it has a huge impact. So we definitely need to be utilizing that going forward. Martyn, would you like to close us off with some remarks?
Yeah, just again, it was following up on the points of, you know, what can people out with Parliament do? And I think it's well worth remembering that in the UK, at some point this year, we're going to have an election. So it's probably worth yourselves drafting a kind of standard letter for people to send to candidates of all parties. Ask them to commit to something. Would it be asking a question of ministers if elected, or something? You know, get something in that they can then be held to account on. You know, and if nothing else, it will prompt them to learn something about Bahrain during the campaign. If they don't know, they'll pass it on to the party's researchers and ask for a brief. That will get us a response out around all of the others as well that don't get the letter, no doubt. So it's probably a good tactic. And then whoever gets in that has signed such a pledge, follow up on it and make sure that they do the actions that have been requested.
Yeah, absolutely. Katie?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think, and it's come up through all the speakers, is highlighting, you know, because you don't, even if you're, yeah, just, I think everyone can be a human rights activist in their own way, but highlighting the links between the UK and Bahrain as very tangible, which they are. We have loads of examples of like the Formula One, of the horse racing, like the picture with the Queen, and making sure that that's like they can try and spread that amongst their friends, their family, not just with parliamentarians, because people are more likely to act when they see that they're actually involved. You know, it's not that this is happening over there and we have no link to it. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I think given the time, I think now would be a good time to call it here. I would just like to sincerely thank every single one of our amazing speakers today, everyone who is attending on the Zoom call, everyone who's watching on YouTube and elsewhere. Your ongoing support is invaluable, and I hope we can bring our collective pressure to bear on the Bahraini authorities, both in 2024 and in the years going forward. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to working with you all in the coming months and years as well. And yeah, have a lovely weekend. Thank you so much.